So last time we met our metacognitive conscious thinking, which the psychologist Jonathan Haidt compares to a lawyer riding on the back of the elephant, whose usual function is just to make excuses for the elephant, for the non-conscious cognition, which is doing its own thing. And all the lawyer can do, all the metacognition can do, is just give ad hoc explanations, justify whatever it does, whatever it thinks after the fact. So the elephant, our non-conscious cognition, or at least the cognition that happens in the background most of the time, comes across an issue, comes across a problem, and immediately feeds an answer to the conscious reflection. And sometimes that answer is right. It might be working on a heuristic, a rule of thumb or a pattern that's right 9 times out of 10, or maybe just 6 times out of 10. So it's something that works sometimes, maybe not all the time. And when that happens, when that pattern pops into your mind, when that answer to a problem pops into your mind, your conscious reflective awareness has 2 choices. A, accept system 1's answer and then defend it. Use confirmation bias, use rationalization, use logical fallacies that make it seem persuasive without actually rethinking system 1's answer. Or it could do B, which is to question system 1's answer and investigate it before deciding, before anchoring on that answer, and before giving itself that feeling of closure. And if your metacognitive awareness chooses A, then it's using motivated reasoning. If it starts with an answer and then just tries to defend it, just tries to confirm it without questioning it, that's motivated reasoning. It's motivated to get to a foregone conclusion. So it begins with a conclusion and tries to persuade others, sometimes tries to persuade yourself to accept it without adequately investigating its accuracy. But if it goes with B, if it questions the first idea, the first answer, then it's using critical reasoning. It's attempting to falsify a claim before accepting it as valid. Now notice here, critical reasoning, and this is the way we're going to use the word throughout the rest of the course, is not just being critical of other people's ideas. That's easy. Everybody can be critical of other people's ideas. Critical reasoning means you're being critical of your own ideas. And whichever strategy, whatever the metacognitive system 2 decides to do next, is going to be an argument. It's either going to be a motivated argument or it's going to be a critical argument. Now, what do I mean by argument? Let's start with a definition. And anytime you start with a definition, remember that anyone who writes, the editors of any dictionary are following the use of a word in language. They're not determining it. They're not setting out to say, well, here's what this word means once and for all. But a dictionary definition is sometimes a good place to start, especially if you're trying to rethink the way we think of a term. And I advise you to use the Oxford English Dictionary for this. We have access to that through the TAMU-CC library. If you go on to the database search on the library website, you can get to the Oxford English Dictionary. It's going to be a lot more helpful than dictionary.com or something like that. And so if I look up argument, I see quite a few definitions. Some make sense, some fit the pattern that I expect it to fit. Like a statement of fact advanced for the purpose of influencing the mind. That sounds like what I typically use the word argument to mean, but then I'll see a few definitions that don't quite fit, like in math or astronomy, the angle, arc, or other mathematical quantity from which another required quantity may be deduced or on which calculations depend. Okay, I can see clearly this one does not fit what I'm using, the pattern I'm looking for, but let's keep looking down. If I look at definition 4, I see a connected series of statements and reasons intended to establish a position, a process of reasoning and argumentation. Or definition 5, a statement of the reasons for and against a proposition or discussion of a question, a debate. Notice that these 2 definitions, with the possible exception of the word debate, these 2 definitions don't necessarily involve another mind. They don't involve persuasion. They can be weighing 2 different answers to a question without necessarily trying to convince someone else. So that's a key definition that I want us to keep in mind. There are arguments that are there to persuade, and then there are arguments that are there to just understand. So we typically think of an argument like this. We've got 2 minds, and now that we are dividing the 2 processes of the mind up into system 1 and system 2, we know our lawyer, our system 2, is really good at taking the knee-jerk assumptions of our habitual thinking processes, our system 1, and immediately arguing for them, rationalizing them, confirming them, and defending them against anyone who doesn't share them. So you can imagine two minds in an argument shouting at each other, "You're wrong." And then the first person says, "You're wrong," and the second person says, not just "you're wrong," but you don't even know the difference between you are apostrophe RE and your possessive. So this might be the kind of thing you see happening in an online argument, especially on Twitter or in the comment section of some web page. The purpose here isn't to refute something specific, it's just to attack the other person. This is an argument of persuasion. This is what we typically think of. This is what definition 3 was in the Oxford English Dictionary. It was not just thinking about something to understand it, but thinking about it in order to come up with reasons to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. This is a very intuitive, very natural reflex for people. And it's probably that way because this is most likely why the lawyer evolved on the back of the elephant. Jonathan Haidt mentions this when he first uses that metaphor. And other psychologists and anthropologists go beyond Haidt and Kahneman and others to say that our conscious awareness probably didn't evolve so that it would help us understand the world better. It probably evolved in order to help us raise our status within a group. Human beings are social animals. We depend on other people's trust and confidence and cooperation. And if we can get them to trust us more by deceiving ourselves to say that we're much better group members than we actually are. People tend to drastically overestimate the work they put into a group effort. You know this if you have a roommate. Your roommate thinks he does more than you do when you think you do more than he does. But there's a benefit in overestimating the work we do, which is we stand up for ourselves and we tell other people, we remind other people, hey, I did this, this, and this. And they will then remind us that they did this, this, and this. Well, that argument is not just about what is accurate, it's about status. It's about getting somebody else to do what you want them to do. And this seems to be as old as the Homo sapiens species itself. We evolved, our brains co-evolved with the group size, or with the size of the groups that we live in. Now, this hypothesis has been advanced by the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who argues that communication, gossip, or whatever took the place of apes grooming each other. This is the way we just talk about things in order to build bonds between our friends and sort of establish who's in our in-group and who's not. The anthropologist Robert Trivers and the psychologist William von Hippel have pointed out that the more easily we can convince ourselves of something, even if it's wrong, that actually improves our status. It improves our ability to deceive other people. It makes us more charismatic. It makes us better able to get what we want from other people. That is, deluding ourselves might seem like a bad thing, but there is actually an advantage, a social advantage, to being, let's say, naive in your metacognition. And then the anthropologists and philosophers Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber have argued that the reasoning process itself might have evolved not so that we can understand the components of how things in nature work, but in order to make us better able to manipulate other people. And so this is why arguments for persuasion are everywhere. You learn to do this, or you don't even have to learn to do this. You know how to do this from the time you're born. An infant screams because it wants something. It wants to be fed. It wants to be held. It wants to know there's someone there taking care of it. And it doesn't even have to know that it wants those things. It just enunciates that verbal outcry, and the parent knows how to respond. Once a child learns how to speak, he or she can make demands and try to manipulate other people through making arguments, even very simple arguments. And unfortunately, that's something we don't grow out of, these self-deceptive or hollow arguments that are just meant to manipulate people. This is the core of politics. This is the core of marketing. Anytime somebody's trying to sell you something, you have to assume they're lying, even if they don't know they're lying. The goal of sales is to give someone as little as possible and get as much in return for that thing as you can. And this is the only kind of argument where it makes sense to say that you win an argument or lose an argument. You win even if you don't convince the person with whom you're arguing, you argue with that person, you resort to insults and that sort of thing, not because you're trying to win that person over, but you're trying to win over an audience who's listening to both of you talk. And so it's all about your status. It's not about investigating the thing you're talking about. You're not actually in this argument to learn more. You're in this argument to tell other people what they ought to think. And the strategy is motivated reasoning. We use confirmation bias. We use logical fallacies. We use things that sway thinking without actually making it better. But once that faculty evolved, once we were able to reject an idea and point out all the ways that idea was wrong, we then had the option to turn that on our own thinking. We then had the option to take the quick and dirty and simple and simplistic answers that System 1 feeds up to System 2 and say, wait a second, that might not be accurate. I feel like latching onto that answer. I feel like seizing and freezing onto that pattern that I think I see. But what if I'm wrong? What if this other person is right? It's usually really hard to do this when we're in an actual argument, when we're face to face with someone, because we're in that fight or flight mode and our need for closure is very, very, very high. But when we step away, when we calm down, when we're on our own, that's when the need for closure might be reduced a little bit. And that's when our System 2, our metacognition, might turn and investigate itself and say, what about this other information? This person brought up a good point. Let me see if I can actually investigate that. And then you have the possibility, at least, that you might discover that you're wrong. And we're going to call this an argument of inquiry. And in this kind of argument, you're still debating two different possible outcomes, two different possible answers, but the goal is no longer to win by defeating someone else. It's no longer just to persuade. The goal is now to actually be more accurate. So if I'm right, I want to convince other people. Yeah, but if I'm wrong and I convince other people, now we're all wrong. Now I don't get the benefits of accurately understanding the world I'm living in. And this is the kind of philosophical argument that goes back at least 2,500 years to the time when Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, as well as the pre-Socratic philosophers, were starting to take all the assumptions that people had and reinforced within a society and say, hey, what if that's not actually accurate? What if we don't know as much as we think we do? And remember, Socrates was the one whose key philosophical insight was, I don't actually know that much. All the things that seem familiar to me, that seem like simple answers, they might be wrong, or at least I don't know why they're right. I haven't tried to investigate them. I haven't tried to falsify them yet. And when arguments of inquiry take place, they don't usually take place on a debate stage with two people yelling at each other. And they don't take place usually in a very short time frame. And they don't usually make the sort of simple arguments that we see on cable news or something like that. If you were to read an academic journal or look at this poster on the top right, you might immediately have that same feeling you get when you look at a really complicated math problem, or you have computer problems and you know it's going to take a lot of reprogramming in order to fix this problem. In other words, you realize solving this problem or just engaging with this issue is going to take a lot of mental effort. It's going to take System 2 to come online, to slow everything down, to be very deliberative, to use a lot of mental energy in figuring out this issue. And that can be discouraging. It would be a lot easier if I, turned on video games that sort of threw information at me that I could respond to really quickly. I could use System 1 more, use System 2 less. The same thing if you turn on cable news and you hear two sides yelling at each other. You just pick a side and then you root for them like it's a spectator sport. But those are System 1 persuasion arguments. System 2 arguments of inquiry are a lot more difficult, and just like any other difficult problem, it's best to write them down, even if you're writing down something really complicated and really scary like this poster on the right. And that's why we write essays. Now, I know this isn't necessarily the first thing that pops in your mind when you hear the word essay. You've learned a pattern, just like the pattern recognition exercises we did in the last lecture. The word essay probably triggers a pattern, a coherent set of words and visual ideas, like the computer screen, having to write something out. Maybe it triggers the idea of a 5-paragraph essay or an opinion essay or a report where you just dump a lot of information that you found in different sources into one Word document and then you submit that. But that's not an essay. An essay, if we look this up, we see some definitions that don't match our idea at all. We see things like the action of, or process of trying or testing, a trial, testing, proof, experiment, the trial of metals. Well, what does that mean? That can't have anything to do with the kind of essay we have to write in here. Where is what I know as an essay? Oh, here it is down here, definition number 8. A composition of moderate length on any particular subject or branch of a subject, originally implying the want of finish, an irregular, undigested piece. Hey, that's the kind of thing I'm used to turning in. The kind of thing I sit down late at night, the night before it's due, and I just type out all the ideas I have. All these claims I want to make, I just sort of write them down, and then that's good enough for an essay, right? Well, it's not good enough for an essay in here, at least. There is a reason all of these definitions come under this same word. The idea of an essay we have now did evolve from that original definition. That first definition about a trial or a testing or proof, that's one of the earliest definitions. That word essay comes from the Latin word exagium, which means weighing. And it's used in the sense of testing to see if a coin is made out of pure gold. In the ancient world, if you wanted to pay for something using gold, you couldn't just take something from a particular mint and say, well, this is from a government mint, therefore it is composed of exactly the same material as every other coin like it. You could melt those coins down, pour tin or some other cheap metal into that, and print new coins and make it seem as if this coin was made of pure gold when actually it was only partly gold. So if you were accepting gold from somebody else, you would have to test it. You would take these scales and you would take something of the same size that you knew was actual gold, and you would put it on the scale opposite this thing that this other person was giving you. And if what the other person was giving you was mixed with something else, it would be lighter because gold is very heavy. So your gold would go down and that other person's gold would go up, and you would know you're being cheated. So notice in this kind of weighing, this kind of test, you have to have two things in order to compare to each other. You're not going to be able to test something by itself. And that led to this more general term of exaggerate, which is to weigh or to prove or to try, to examine something, to inquire into something. So here's our connection to an argument of inquiry. An essay is an inquiry, it's a test. It's where we take the ideas that we're sort of connected to, our own ideas, but we weigh them against other ideas. We don't just dismiss the other ideas. We don't say that, well, I know my idea is right, so I'm just going to repeat it over and over again for 5 pages. We say, let's compare it in as objective a manner as we can with all of these other ideas to see which one works the best. And that distinction, introducing this other kind of essay into a college writing classroom, that's what the professor of rhetoric, Jack Milan, proposed in his essay, which I asked you to read, which is Argument of Writing, Persuasion or Inquiry. And he addresses the fact that most people, most of the time, are taught to write persuasive essays. They're taught to start with their own idea and try to persuade other people to believe that their idea is the best idea out there. And you might be very good at this. You might be very good at persuading other people. But you can persuade other people by using confirmation bias. You can persuade other people by using logical fallacies. And in those cases, you win the persuasive argument. But notice, if more people are wrong, if you were wrong to start with and you've convinced other people to be wrong as well, your status might go up, but your knowledge goes down. Something is lost in your connection to the real world. And that's why Milan says that the activity of finding out which position is the strongest position, which position is most worthy of our belief, that is prior and more fundamental than the task of presenting this position persuasively to the reader. So he says he will use the name inquiry for the activity of finding out which position is most worthy of our belief. And the activity of inquiry is carried out through argumentation. The position which is most worthy of our belief is a position best supported by good reasons for believing. And these reasons take the form of arguments. An argument is a reason for believing a position on a topic or a question. The best reasons or arguments are those which not only give plausibility, in other words, they have a coherence about them, but remember what Daniel Kahneman said about coherence, it can be deceptive. So they not only give plausibility to the position, but they also withstand the test, the weighing, the exaggerate of objections by generating strong replies to those objections. In other words, I have to know not only my position and the reason for it, but I need to know these other positions. I need to know their reasons. I need to know what counter-argument somebody might make to my position, to my argument, and I need to have a reply to that ready. And if my reply to that counter-argument is not very good, then I have a lot more work to do. And so he says that inquiry must occur first in order for subsequent persuasion to be ethically correct. In other words, so that we don't get really good at persuading people of really bad answers. Since it is unethical to try to persuade someone of any position except that which the persuader believes on good grounds to be the strongest. And let's not forget that phrase, on good grounds. Remember the illusion of knowledge, the illusion of explanatory depth. Just because you believe your position doesn't mean you're ready to make that argument yet. You have to try to falsify it. You have to try to find where you might be wrong. You have to test your assumption before you're ready to then go back and persuade someone to try to understand what you're saying. And if you look at the way that Milan's article is put together, you see that he's practicing what he's preaching. He is introducing an issue that people might not have realized was an issue, a problem that people might not have normally thought about. This is the best kind of arguments. Don't just take a common issue that everybody's aware of being controversial, pick a side and just repeat one of those sides. A good essay does what good metacognition does. It takes an assumption that people might not even realize is problematic, and it looks to see if there are better ways of answering a question. So he introduces this commonly accepted idea that we should teach students in a college classroom to write persuasively. And then he points out an issue, a problem, something that needs to be further investigated. And then he weighs the different potential answers to that question, the different solutions to that problem. And he picks one and shows why it has more advantages than the alternative answers that might be more familiar, that might be more popular. So in doing that, he reminds us that an essay is a working out of an argument, is a testing of an argument, but that argument has to be connected to an issue. And an issue is a problem that needs to be solved, or it's a question with more than one possible answer, a situation that could have more than one plausible explanation. Even if nobody else has noticed this problem but you, it might be a problem that still needs a lot of investigation, a lot of research, a lot of rethinking. So let's put this all back in context. If we have an issue, a problem that needs to be solved, or a problem that needs an answer, such as the bat and ball question, it doesn't take much to come up with an answer. Some sort of immediate pattern or immediate response that comes from relatively low effort, relatively high speed cognition. But once that happens, our metacognition, our conscious awareness of our thinking and of our problem solving comes online. And it has a choice. Do you go with your first thought? Do you anchor to it and then back it up with confirmation bias? If you do, that's motivated reasoning. That's beginning with a conclusion and trying to persuade others to accept it. Motivated reasoning wants to immediately set you off to make an argument of persuasion. Or do you question that first thought? Do you say, hang on, I may not know all I need to know, or the things I'm adding into that pattern to make it coherent might not actually belong there? Do I need to rethink that first? Do I need to learn more about this, even if it seems familiar? And if you do that, you're using critical thinking. I hope you'll choose B, in this class especially, but also throughout college, and anytime you're not under a time constraint. We can't think reflectively about everything that we pass by, every blade of grass that we step on when we walk across a field. But when it comes to the issues that matter, we want to turn on our deliberative system 2 metacognition, and we want it to do something more than just defend the system 1 answer. And one way to keep track of this critical reasoning, to make it clear to ourselves how our thinking works, as well as make it clear to other people, is to write it down. And that's the beginning of the essay process, a process of questioning, researching, second guessing, testing, falsifying, and ultimately, hopefully, finding a better answer. And even if our answers don't change, they become more qualified, and they can actually earn our confidence and the confidence of other people. And that essay writing process is a long process, but we're going to take it one step at a time. For now, it's most important just to remember why we are doing it, instead of just writing whatever System 1 blurts out. This is why we're going to go through a lot of steps that might not have been necessary in your past writing classes or in your past writing assignments. They might not even be necessary in the papers you write for other classes. But they're going to be not just words on a page. The words on the page are going to show a rethinking of a thinking process. They're going to show your investigation, your collection of new information, but also your explicit awareness about how that information, that evidence, leads to one conclusion instead of another conclusion. So the next step, find an issue that's interesting to you, that's relevant to you, but something that you're not going to be too tempted to jump to one particular conclusion regarding. Something you actually know that you need to know more about. The issue you choose is you want to choose something that is interesting enough that you can continue to investigate it throughout the rest of the semester. You want something that people have different perspectives about, so that you can compare those perspectives. You can see how other people's arguments are put together, why they contradict each other, which premises they don't share. And once you find that issue, start to write out a proposal for your research project. Look ahead at the types of essays we're going to write as you're writing your research project. Write down what the issue is, why it's relevant, to whom is it relevant, what are the different things that people say about that issue. Do people divide up into camps that tend to side with one perspective versus another? In the act of writing that proposal, you're probably going to find right away that something you thought was relatively simple is actually a little bit more complicated. And hopefully you realize that complicated is good, or recognizing that something is complicated is the first step. That's a good thing. It may seem intimidating, but that means that your system 2 is working. It is thinking critically, and that's a good thing.